Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a second. Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla Giese. I'm the SB 671 coordinator at the California Transportation Commission. I'm on Hannah Walter's team. Thank you for joining us today for the SB 671 Freight Data Workshop. I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. Excuse me. I'm also glad that you all found the right address. Sorry for the mix-up. So first, the emergency exits are out these two back doors and through the lobby if you need them. We also are recording, so that's why our speakers are up here on the stage. We're hoping that we'll be able to send that out after the workshop also in case you need to share it with your staff or anything like that. We will also be taking 2 breaks today as shown on the agenda after each presentation. Feel free to grab a snack in the lobby or do some networking. And we are going to have a discussion and question time at the end of the presentations. We are asking that you either use the podium down there or we do have some free mics, so we'd like you to raise your hand if you'd rather us bring you a free mic to use. And again, that will be at the end of the agenda. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to kick it off to our Chief Deputy and Woman of the Year, Tanisha Taylor, to give some opening remarks.
Thank you, Kayla. It's always a pleasure when your team really likes you, and so having a good time here. I appreciate that, Kayla. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kayla, for introducing me. I'm Tanisha Taylor. I'm the Chief Deputy of the California Transportation Commission. Thank you for joining us today. It's so nice to see you all in this in-person event. It's really a monumentous occasion at this point in our careers when we can all come together and get to know each other a little more. So I'd like to also take a minute to thank our sister agency partners for their collaboration on this work, as well as our very own commission team. It takes a lot to get to these meetings, and I really appreciate all of the work across all of us. While the commission is the lead agency responsible for the development of the SB 671 study, we take a Big Ten approach to policy development. We've had the privilege of getting an in-depth look at some of the statewide freight modeling efforts underway, and we've been impressed with what is being done. Today, we want to highlight for discussion the great work the Army Corps of Engineers Engineer Research and Development Center and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory is doing. The work is key as we try to figure out zero-emission infrastructure needs across California. It helps lay the groundwork for data-informed decision-making by our policymakers. We appreciate all of you spending the day with us, and our SB 671 team looks forward to the continued collaboration among our partners, stakeholders, and work group members. And with that, I'll turn it over to our very own Hannah Walter.
I'm just going to be really quick. Thank you for coming. And this meeting is part of an ongoing conversation that a lot of you have been a part of, and we couldn't do it without your input. So keep thinking as the presenters are showcasing their work. Hang on to your questions and please ask them. And without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Linkoff and Dr. Kelsey Stoddard.
Thank you very much. Let's see, do I just go down? Perfect. It's really an honor to be here. We were lucky that we worked with Hannah and the Commission for over 1 year now. And it was a really rewarding project. And I'm glad, I know that we were in multiple conference calls, so I'm glad to be here in person. let me start with a little bit about my organization, because I don't think that many of you knows about Army Engineer Research and Development Center. Like simplifying, we have McKinsey here, so you can think about golden standard of think tank in industry. You can think about us the same way as golden standard of think tank in government. But seriously, we are a large research and development organization. We have about 2,500 people. We are federal government. I mean, next presentation is from DOE Lab. They are on contracting side. But we are federal government, and the whole idea is to build internal expertise to solve problem that Army Corps, and government in general have. What is unique about Army Corps of Engineers and our organization is that we have both civilian and military program. That's one unique feature. We have two different lines of budget coming to us. And it's kind of give us ability to see very different worlds. And the other unique feature, we are project funded. So in a sense, we are cousins with DOE Labs because we need to find funding. But the difference is that as a federal agency, we have very different ways of doing that. Well, the idea, obviously, Army Corps built for other agencies, but same kind of spills out on research. If we have a need outside of Army Corps, Army, or even federal government, we have all kinds of funding mechanism and contracting mechanism to really support whatever the needs are. So, and it was very cool. I have been with Army Corps of Engineers for 15 years, and I did like a lot of different work. So, my job is actually, and you know, as many of us bring new ideas in federal government, and because we are project funded, I can pretty much find things to do across, right? So, and one area was supply chain. When we first approached, actually California Transportation Commission approached us about 18 months ago, supply chain crisis was just emerging. We had like congestion in Port of LA and Port of Long Beach. And at that point, we already had a significant portfolio of supply chain work on military sites. And what we start doing in this project, we try to think, okay, how you deal with disruptions in complex system like transportation. It's kind of builds on the body of work that we do along the line of what is the system thinking about a complex system in general, system that composed of multiple individual components that are connected. So in case of California Transportation Commission, obviously we see problem at port, and government, as you know, dropped like another $2 billion on Port of LA. It's really good for them, but Port of LA is one of the best ports from point of view of optimization of everything. So what is going to happen is that they will be able to get even more ships and goods. And the problem, the way we found, is actually not port, but trucks. So that's why we kind of quickly refocus our kind of supply chain exploration from ports to trucks. And that's what you're going to see. But in a very general sense, I like to give you a couple of highlights, and Kelsey will go to details. I know that most of the people here are more applied. What we deal with often is two concepts that are connected but different, risk and resilience, right? So most of what we do in transportation, we try to manage risk. So if you think about critical function of transportation system, you know, bringing people from one place to another, we like to maintain it, and we like to harden transportation networks so it doesn't fail. And that was natural reaction, like, you know, see problem in the ports, why don't we harden port, right? But the problem is that that's only part of the problem, right? We have these interconnected networks, and often, no matter what we do in hardening system, they fail. And you can see here degradation in response of disruptions. And often you find yourself in the crisis situation. And the way we deal with resilience, we like to find a way to enhance system ability to recover. And for that, you need to plan. So in a sense, the methods that you use for planning for avoiding failure is very different than tools and methods that you use for recovery. The science of recovery of complex system, including supply chain, is new. We, an Army Corps of Engineers, believe me, build a lot of stuff over like our 250 years history, but we always look at idea that we build something that is not going to fail, and if you get more money, we can deal with smaller and smaller risk. But we now see that because we are so interconnected, we are going to fail. And the idea of recovery is new, and especially it's new when you kind of link this kind of more physical component of recovery, like network, with social. And this is exactly what happened with transportation supply chain. And all of this crises, including infant formulas supply chain and all that, the supply chain and transportation network don't exist in vacuum. They really meet societal needs. And these connections of how to do that is really important. So what you're going to hear today is two approaches to kind of get quantification of transportation network and specifically truck movements, and with the idea that you're extracting information about optimizing I think in both cases, location of refueling station, but you can think about any other issues. And in a more general sense, we use metrics-based and model-based approaches. Metrics-based, we are not going to talk about. They are very simple. You try to get something that you can measure, and you use it to optimize location of station, whatever it is. It's very simplistic. Usually metrics, what you can measure, it's integration of multiple factors. And we use them, but we like to go to model-based approaches. Model-based approaches designed to approximate reality by specific models. And what you're going to see, it's two approaches. Kelsey is going to present more like statistical data-driven approaches. We use extensive databases to do that. And you will hear a presentation from Lawrence Berkeley Lab that use agent-based models. And that approach, so data-driven approaches require a lot of data, but they don't have calibration process, right? So if you go to agent-based model or networks model that we use, but we are not presenting them today, you calibrate these models based on actual data, and it gives you a better ability to predict into the future, as long as the process is the same. And this is a big problem in many modeling approaches. The process is changing, and what's happening today or yesterday is not really representative of what's going to happen tomorrow. So that's kind of deficiency of agent-based and other models. Deficiency of data-driven model is that it's kind of snapshot of what's happening now, but it's data-driven. Anyway, so keep that in mind when you think about that. So I guess a little bit of work that we are not presenting today, but I thought I would mention, we really look at network models that represent transportation network and model efficiency of this network and resilience, ability to perform well and have less traffic, that's efficiency, and resilience is ability to recover from major accidents, and they are very different. And again, I'm not going to talk about that, but we connect this with regional economic models, so we can see impact of lack of efficiency and lack of resilience in multiple cities that we work with regional economic modeling for that. But results are very interesting. Again, we are not going to talk much about that, but you can see like LA and San Francisco, they're equally inefficient, a lot of traffic, but LA is far more resilient than San Francisco. Why? Because there are many roads in LA, and there are no complex geography like water, bridges, long stretches of the highway. So all of that makes LA more resilient than San Francisco, right? And obviously, this translate in cost associated with lack of resilience. You can see that lack of resilience is far more costly than lack of efficiency. So and it translates in different actions. So I hope at some point we can get back to California Transportation Commission and reanalyze what we do now, what we're going to see, with the idea that what needs to be done to improve resilience of transportation networks, specifically for trucks. And the way, again, we see that it's like resilience is property of the system, and you need to connect social, physical, and cyber networks to have better control, better management, and other factors. So let me stop here. We published a lot on that, but I thought we'd given like a little bit of science background on why we do what Kelsey is going to present is important, and maybe it will give you perspective on what can be done. But with that, Kelsey.
Okay, so I'm going to be presenting the specific work that we've been doing for the California Transportation Commission. The first major result that we had is related to optimizing locations for heavy and medium zero-emission infrastructure, and there's a number of legislative motivations for that. The problem, though, as we saw it, is that these legislations are going to be pushing freight over to zero emission, and while they're building up this infrastructure, that's going to cause diversion to their routes. So we wanted to identify gas stations that can be converted to refueling stations such that they would minimize freight while also being scalable as more were built. Kind of as Igor mentioned, we like to take kind of a very high-level approach. So in this case, we wanted to take a statewide approach. Originally, we wanted to do a big multimodal model, but we ended up really focusing on freight for this project. Our approach was to get kind of data, combine that with different algorithms and techniques to try and get these location prioritization. The two different data sets that we used were from Replica, and then we also used GPS data. And we have a representative here from Replica, which is really cool to see. So the first thing we did was, from those two different data sets, we tried to get an idea of where is freight moving throughout the state. So for Replica, we were able to kind of break down their data to get kind of road volumes in many different views. Here on the right, I'm showing kind of the aggregate numbers, so overall, but we did actually break this down in many different ways. We also did kind of the same exercise with our GPS data. And then after we kind of got an idea of where freight was moving, to get at this idea of optimal locations, we ended up using or posing the problem as a facility location problem. So in a facility location problem, you have some sort of demand and facilities. In this case, it's freight demand and the refueling stations, and you want to assign all of that demand to your locations such that you're minimizing everybody's travel time. So this is really trying to kind of make everybody as happy as possible in this model. Something I'm showing here is that one of the variables that we could change, though, is how many facilities are available. So here on the right, you'll see kind of 3 facilities that you're assigning everybody to, but you could also repeat it with 4, and that is important later in our methodology. So for that kind of a problem, you need a number of different quantities, but the first is your actual freight demand. So we took our aggregate freight road volumes and converted that into fuel consumption based off of census block. Then we got gas stations and service stations in the state and said if there's any of those in any census block, then that census block is a candidate. So while I'm showing the individual stations here, we actually are kind of calling our locations the census blocks that contain them. The next thing that you need for this kind of a problem is what is your distance between your demand and each of your locations. And for that, we used replica data. In this case, we said if there are trips going from any block where you have demand to a block where you have a location, give me the mean travel time. And the idea here was that we wanted to use a congestion-aware travel time rather than just either as the bird flies or if there's no traffic, to be a little more realistic. And then for the optimization with those elements, we were able to say, if you can only have 500 stations, which ones would minimize total statewide travel time? So that gets at the first half of our problem, which was where are the optimal locations? The second half was we want these to be scalable over time. So for that, we used a quantity that we've been calling hubness. In hubness, we first look at what is the one best. And I'm showing LA here as maybe kind of a toy example just to illustrate the idea. But what is, if you can only have one station, everybody has to go through there. What's the one best? What's the two best? What's the three best? And then we grab any stations that appear in any of those kind of scaling solutions and say how many of those solutions do any of them appear in. And if it appears in many of them, then that's one that even as you continue to add more, seems to scale well over time. So in our, back to the statewide view, we repeated that exercise of our optimization, scaling from 1 to 500, and said, for any one that appears in there, how many of them does it appear in? An interesting result here is that it turns out many of them appear in the vast majority of the previous solutions, so we see ones with very high hubness numbers, which means that, in this case, our methodology is showing that a lot of the sites would really scale well over time. We would love to include additional factors in the future, equity concerns or other elements, but stay tuned, maybe we can do that. One other additional result that we had is that we did manage to get the Caltrans climate vulnerability assessment put in our maps. And we wanted to look at what happens if you overlay those on top of your freight volumes, just to start getting an idea of what is the vulnerability of different kind of roads to these, to freight. So one example of that is that I'm showing on the left here, internal California freight. So this is freight that both long haul, that both starts and ends its trip in California. You can see a lot moving between San Francisco and LA. On the right, I've overlaid a fire vulnerability layer. If we zoom in, you can see that there's this one spot near Stockton where the two highways get very close to each other. That's also vulnerable to wildfires, which seems quite bad if you have a lot of goods moving through there and a particular point of interest. We also did similar things with sea level rise, looking at different areas in, say, San Francisco, where you have a lot of freight that's also vulnerable to sea level rise. So these are kind of the two major results that I felt like would be relevant to the SB 671 group. As Igor mentioned, we have a lot of other ideas that we'd love to work on in this space. Maybe before I wrap it up, I just wanted to give a quick summary of what I felt were some of the benefits of the approach that we took. We really looked at this from a system level, so a statewide level, rather than kind of individual regions, to try and say, overall, what would be best for freight at that level. We also think that it links kind of freight with these policies at that level. And then last, that our approach is data-driven. We think that's a strength of this approach in that it really is able to discover non-obvious real-world relationships that you might not otherwise be able to find. Okay, And with that, does anybody have any questions? Yes. Yes.
Maybe if you can introduce yourself or everybody who asks questions.
Maybe while I have a second. Also, I wanted to thank the CTC for sponsoring this event. Very excited to be here.
So you talked about scalability, and
Yes.
one of the issues, we're doing something actually very similar to what you're doing. But a big issue for us is as you scale up, the demand increases. And the question is, at any given time, if you put a station in 2025, what should be the size of the station? You can put something in that's maybe a little bigger than what you need at that moment, but 5 years or 10 years from then, you will need more in that region. And the question becomes, do you build bigger stations earlier in time that are expensive and aren't necessarily used anywhere near to their capability, or do you try and stay closer to meeting the actual demand and then having to build more smaller stations in the future, smaller stations being more expensive per kilogram? So did you look at that, and did you try to optimize, cost over time?
No, I don't think we did look at kind of cost over time. I think we were specifically looking for the commission's interest at, if they were going to be assessing individual locations, just where would this be good, be good over time. But we didn't look at specifically the size. We have talked about kind of expanding this model to be include capacity, because at the moment I think that is something that it could use, would be the capacity of individual stations. And I think if we were to expand it in that way, that could be a way that we could include that.
What time year did you look out to in terms of your demand?
So we, especially for the ATRI data, or the GPS data that we used for the demand, we used 6 weeks throughout the year. I think there was March, June, but there were weeks across the whole year, so it's somewhat average.
But I mean, what, like 2030, 2040, how far
we
did you
used
look
data
out?
in the past, so we used current demand numbers rather than projecting into the future. So I think it was 2020, if I remember right.
Thanks.
Let me add to that. This is a problem that very common across multiple type of infrastructure development that we have. And what we like to do, it's not just future, but rather what are the how much you need to build to deal with multiple disruptions. Like if you have just enough, this is what problem with supply chain. We optimize it just in time and all that. Now if one piece fails, like we have cascading failure. So the first question I like to address is like what should be a resilient approach, right? Probably need to more than what we have here, but the way to do this through stress testing and understand that. And then as a part of that, we can look at different futures. And then the interesting question is how much of this extra that you build for possible stresses would cover future, right? So this is kind of framing that they like to have here, but very good question. Thank you. Okay, Hannah, I guess you need to moderate because we have many people.
Hi, just really quickly. How do you account for fueling time? Because there's differences between battery electric, hydrogen fuel cells.
And if I answer this? So questions about the utilization and the fuel time, we are thinking about that for the assessment, but not as part of the modeling that the Corps is talking about right now. So we can talk about that, but I don't know how ready I am to tell you what our conclusions are. I think maybe after March we might be ready. So our next meeting is in March, and it's like near the end. So we might have some more feedback for you then. But right now, like the questions about, utilization and capacity, we're actually doing that right now. So we're not quite ready to answer those questions yet, but we will be.
Maybe to build on that a little bit, something we did try and do is make sure that this approach was agnostic in terms of either electric or hydrogen, because the commission didn't want to kind of prescribe that. So we just tried to say where's best for freight. That's the answer that we want to, or the question we want to answer.
John Barnett with ANRAB Associates. Can you give us some examples of non-obvious conclusions?
I think the hubness was one example, saying that, yes, as the locations that we found using this method, some of them, were in 400 of the 500 solutions, or, appeared many, many times. So being able to identify that, these are locations that will scale well, but also that there are locations that will scale that well, I think was something we did not expect.
Can you define hubness for us?
Yes. So that was that we ran the optimization for 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 500, and said how many does any station appear in? Does it appear in many of them or very few? If it's only good, when there's 4 and it's never good again, that may not be one that scales well. So that was kind of a quantity we came up with for this.
Is that derived by volume of trucks?
So it's derived from running the same kind of optimization we ran to find the 500. So saying, given all the demand that exists, what's the best 1, 2, 3 in the state?
Okay, but can you give us the qualities of hubness? In other words, is it volume? Is it because it's on the 710 and it's right there in an arterial? I'm trying to get a sense of.
So it is just how many of those does it appear in. So if it's just a count of how many it appears in. So, but what we saw was, if we look at maybe this map, you often see, in LA or something, because those are the ones that, or in San Francisco, that these were in areas that, it's right along the highway. It's in a place where there's significant amount of demand. Were kind of some of the things we were seeing when looking at it visually.
Let me give you a different answer. At least in my whatever 30 years professional career, sometimes you see, you work hard to find something and then it's obvious, but it's not. Like, if I ask you, like before this presentation, what is the most crucial place in California for wildfires risk? Probably would not guess, right? Now, of course, you see it's obvious. It's 2 highways close to each other in wildfire-prone areas. So, some of what you see may seem to be obvious, but it's very difficult to guess.
Also, I just want to point out that they looked at distance. So, and basically trying to minimize the disruption to their existing route. That's how they were identifying which locations would be the best to try to help answer your question. If you guys could introduce yourselves and say where you're from before you say your question, that would be great.
We have questions on this side as well. We're going to try to get through everyone, but please make sure you keep us on time, Hannah.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Akiko Yamagami from LA Metro. So I actually have 2 questions. Did you, in your analysis, let's say when you talked about the 500 locations, did you make any assumptions as to like whether they will be all publicly accessible or somewhat like private and public? Because I do think that has an like implication as to when you assign the demand to all those locations, how many demand will be actually fulfilled at each location. And the other question that I have is did you assume the same like power output or the fueling output at all of the locations over time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Thank
so One thing is that this model isn't capacitated, which means that we're not saying that this station can only handle a certain amount of capacity. It is probably one of the biggest things that we would love to include to make it better. But I think because that's not included, we kind of didn't need to do some of the assumptions in terms of, you know, how much power is there, how much, a lot of those other parameters you were talking about.
But again, Akiko, we are working on that now. So we are working on it.
Great, thank you.
And maybe just again, my job is to give you thoughts rather than Kelsey give you actual results. So if you think about the bigger issue, like, you know, what is the minimal number of refueling stations you need to have for the state, right? From that point of view, capacity constraint will naturally come into discussions at that point. And I think that's next step. What we've done, we developed core methodology, and then it can be refined if, you know, California Transportation Commission or somebody else wants to do that.
Maybe that just reminded me of one more non-obvious result was that when I was doing the optimization, there was a point where it stopped finding additional ones, and it turns out I needed to lower a threshold, but that was because everything was assigned to something that had kind of a reasonable travel distance, because I put if it's too far away, give it a really high value, which actually means that's kind of the minimum where everybody is within a reasonable driving distance. So that was another somewhat non-obvious finding, is that we were able to find what that number was.
And this is exactly how we would optimize. We will find this point of nonlinearity when adding station would be, given constraint that we impose, would have diminishing return, right? So that's kind of next steps.
Okay, hi, Vanessa Gerber with East Bay Community Energy. So curious about the locations chosen. Those are presumably existing diesel fueling locations. Curious if, maybe more of a question to Hannah, if the model will be applied to potentially other types of sites. As an example, you know, brownfields that fit into the same type, you know, that have the hubness and but maybe have some more space availability or something as an example, but applying the model to additional sites that might have more space capacity for the fueling.
So let me answer that. I feel like I need to explain the scope of what Dr. Linkoff is presenting, because in the assessment we are looking at like what is the average annual hydrogen that we think will be needed, and electricity, how much do we think will be depot charging versus public charging, questions like that. So we are getting at that, and actually we're working on developing something that we plan to present a draft to commissioners at the March meeting. So we're almost there, and we're working on developing 3 scenarios that kind of look at different possibilities and different splits of battery electric and hydrogen. But the scope of what we asked the Corps to do was really just to do a transportation fleet-centric look based on GPS data of where are the trucks and what causes them the least pain in terms of rerouting. And where are people stopping right now. So that's really what their look is. And for the assessment, we're actually hoping to use all of the information that you're gonna see today. So this is one piece. And then the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs with Dr. Wang, that's another piece that they're looking at that we hope to be able to draw from. And then the consultant that we're working with, McKinsey, we're also working with resources that they're bringing to the table. So really the assessment is pulling from a variety of different sources, but this being one of them. But this is mainly focused on where are the trucks, where are they stopping, where does it make the most sense and cause them the least disruption.
Maybe for the siting too, one other thing is that because we went to the census block level and said, rather than maybe individual stations, and I will say most of the census blocks have at least one gas station, so most were included. But that also means that if you were to want to pick sites that are not necessarily those gas stations, you were to pick an empty lot or something, it still exists in that census block. So, you'd still be able to tell kind of how it compares to other ones.
Bill Elrick, the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership. Thank you for this. This is exciting. And I apologize if I missed this, but recognizing you're not doing the capacity stuff yet here, did you look at minimum or more importantly maybe maximum distances yet to the point of identifying that minimum, what's the word I want to say, viable product or minimum viable station network to satisfy the need?
Yeah, I mean, there was that point where I said, originally when I was running it, it didn't run past, which meant that everybody was assigned to something that they considered reasonable. But beyond that, I don't think that we actually kind of did get out in that final 500 or, at what point are people really, how unhappy, what is the farthest they're having to drive kind of thing.
So maybe the question could be, when you saw that happening, did it happen at 50 stations, 200 stations? Did you start to see that saturation point generally?
Generally, I think it was at like 191 that it stopped running. it was that number, and then I could lower the threshold, and then it would start saying, now that everybody has a reasonable distance, let's start making them happier within that.
Jess Avila with Caltrans. I think you may have answered my question, but I just want to confirm. So phrasing the question a little different. Truck drivers may only drive X amount of hours, right? And so a lot of them probably have certain choice locations where they stop. And so just wondering whether your model, I think you said you might have seen that in the data in terms of where they go and stop, origin, destination. Is that something that you'll be considering, or your model maybe giving you results as to where those locations might be?
Yeah, I think that could be a good idea to look at, where, and we have been talking about going back over those and looking at kind of where is the furthest people are going and things like that, but we don't have it currently that we pulled out.
Yeah. I'd just like to add that, of course, they have their various places to stop, and recharging takes time. Perfect opportunity for them to get their batteries up to wherever they want to get them to.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Quentin G. from the California Energy Commission. I had a question pertaining to maybe kind of like the types of miles that are involved. So because I take these to be public stations, and that I think the traffic is not, I guess I'm trying to think about what types of miles driven or what type of traffic activity might be associated with shorter trips in a local vicinity where one might be more inclined to charge at their yard or depot or wherever, versus longer distance trips where you're kind of, you got to charge at that point, and you can't wait till you get home. So is there a way in which you're trying to capture kind of this area, the miles traveled are less likely to need the public charger?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess one of the things I was trying to scroll down to see if I had it in here, but when we broke up that kind of, let's look at replica data and see what, out of the ports versus maybe long haul, we were seeing that, there's a lot of trips that maybe go from the port to San Bernardino and then back versus kind of very long distance across the state. I think by using kind of existing kind of the replica data rather than just our own made up distances, I think one of the things that'll come from that is, let's say the census block over the port, that one very likely has, a relatively short average trip time to get to other places. And then, there's no trips that go all the way across very far. So I think by using kind of that, we might, hopefully that would somewhat be included in the model.
Hi, Laurel Molina. I'm from Riverside County Transportation Commission. Thank you for the presentation. It's really, really interesting. Just a couple of quick questions. I think I heard that for the GPS data, like 6 weeks of data was used. I'm just curious how that sample was selected. Was it the highest over a year, or whatever the case might be? And then my second question is there like a report or a technical memo that's completed that we can see separately too?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the weeks we chose were, we wanted to be able to compare replica and the GPS data. So I think we tried to kind of line up with some of the data time periods that they had to be able to compare the two well. So really from a modeling side maybe. But we also just kind of selected like once per quarter, somewhat randomly, saying let's just grab one and make sure we're trying to get a sample across the whole year.
Yeah, we were trying to capture seasonality, like maybe what would be the peak portions of the different seasons.
We have time for one more or two more.
Let's take one more, or let's take two more questions since you guys are both right here, and then we'll break. Yeah. Oh, Eric, can you? Okay, thank you. Thanks. We'll catch you.
Hi, Dave Tokarski with DKS Associates. I think you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about if you were using kind of more straight line data or straight line distances between census blocks, or was it actual, roadway distance and circuity based data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we use the times were taken from those replica trips, and a mean trip distance between any two census blocks. So because of that, hopefully it's not just kind of what is your drive time. It's from their data. They have kind of a model that says statewide where are all the trucks moving, and hopefully it would also include kind of congestion drive time as well.
Hi, my name is Simran Judy from Fresno Council of Governments, and I want to say it was a great presentation, and this is very interesting data. And my only question is about the mentioning of more resilience in LA versus San Francisco. So could you again reiterate why that is?
So resilience is ability to recover from disruption. So if you think about San Francisco bridges, long stretches of the highway, if something happened in a bridge, you basically block the traffic completely, right? And it takes a long time to recover from that. In LA, there are no bridges, right? There are no major, well, there are some major highways, obviously, but what happened in LA, if you have an accident, people can get around it. In San Francisco, it's more difficult. So if you think about disruption, in LA, people can find way around it, and it, like on annualized basis, extra delay in LA, if I remember correctly, was in the order of like 3 hours, and average commuting time is like 80 hours in both LA and San Francisco. Like not average commuting time, but yeah, well, I mean, like average commuting time, something. I need to check the numbers, but order of magnitude is the same. So in LA, it's like extra 3 hours because of, random disruptions due to accidents, while in San Francisco, I believe it's in the order of like 40 to 50 hours. So it's a huge difference in resilience, right? So that's why LA is similar in recovery time from accident to most of the good US cities with good transportation network, while San Francisco is one of the worst.
Thank you.
So we just look at network topology, so that's kind of drives it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Linkoff and Dr. Stoddard, for that presentation. Right now, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back at what time? 2:10.
And the last thing I like to add, obviously we open for collaboration and we present multiple ideas. We have some publications related to that. We have not captured this in any papers yet, but hopefully California Transportation Commission will be releasing their reports that capture most of it. Thanks.
There's snacks in the table out in the back too.
Tim. Nice to meet you. No, in fact, we were just wondering to see if.
Let me introduce you to her because Mitch, our director, is not here tonight.
Big mountains going up and big mountains coming down, so trucks have to. I mean, that'll have a much bigger, much bigger. This is obviously a statewide study that you guys are doing. Obviously, the height is a statewide. So this will turn us out to be regional projects. 1, 2, 3. Aren't as big as the state, but are as big as 5, 10 counties. Can we said block. What's a block? We're talking much bigger matrix. That's the way we're looking at the 5 counties, kind of in the middle of on your maps. You saw everything going up and down I-5. Everything we're looking at is testing. There were no dots, or very few dots.
do it.